Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. This is going to be a weird talk. We're going to do a talk called The Case Against Fidelity. My name is Isaque. That's my... Oh, okay. My name is Isaque. This is my social media handle. If you like this talk, follow me on Twitter. I am a senior game designer at Ubisoft Red Links in Finland. And yeah, basically welcome to my talk. We're just going to look at the agenda here. It's going to be a big one. It's actually the first time I presented, so apologies if it runs a little bit late, but I don't think so. So we're going to look at key concepts like visual fidelity, realism, simulation boundary. And after that, we are going to look at the pros for fidelity. So basically, why fidelity is a noble pursuit and the whole idea of the one true sim. Then we are going to look at a bunch of concepts as well and do the cons of fidelity. So we're going to argue for fidelity, we're going to argue against fidelity, we're going to look at the pros and cons, and finally we're going to look at takeaways, what can be done, and how we can do those things. So let's just start. So what is visual fidelity? So in photography, like IKEA, for instance, has been using CGI to render furniture and objects and all sorts of stuff without it even showing to be, without it even looking like fake furniture, right? Like we've reached a point where CGI is kind of everywhere, and it's indistinguishable from real life. And it used to be that it was only applicable to objects like cars, furniture, as I just mentioned. But now it's been applicable to humans. We can actually see renders of humans, and they're kind of indistinguishable from real life as well. The results are hairy, they're convincing. And I'm not even going to talk about AI or like machine learning and all that stuff, but we're heading into that space. So let's use a definition, and first of all agree on what visual fidelity is. I really like this definition. Some people call it photorealism, other people call it realism. We're going to stick with fidelity. I think it's a bit more useful, and I like this definition, by the way. It's the exactness at which a computer can replicate the real world, right? Yeah, and so why are we calling it fidelity, not realism, right? Is this realistic, for instance? We could say it's realistic. Why call it fidelity? It feels we are only using a fancier word for something that's really intuitive. The problem is that no, we kind of use colloquially realism, but in reality, realism is very specific. Like in painting, realism is an artistic movement. In very different disciplines, it's a concrete thing. In philosophy, realism is also something very specific. In the law, it's also something very specific. So if in every discipline we use specific words, I assume that we would like to use specific words in our discipline as well. So it's not really wordplay. But we could still call the cave we just saw realistic, right? You might say it looks real. Well, I also have a problem with that. So Monet was the founder of Impressionism. The whole point of Impressionism was to capture reality in its subjective state, like cast a wider lens. And he famously said, paint what you see, what you really see, not what you ought to see. So he would maybe disagree that the cave is realistic. He would see it in another way. He would maybe try to capture the subjective part of that cave. We could even go into the whole cliche discussion of what is reality and whatever. But to simplify and to stick with something simple, let's go with fidelity then. So to also look at the scope of fidelity and to see that fidelity and believability are not exactly the same thing as well, let's look at the Tomb Raider series. This is, I think, the last Tomb Raider in that series. It came out in 2018. It's really high fidelity for the time. Like the level, and even today, like the level of presentation is amazing, the level of detail, it's incredible. But we're going to focus on one clip, and really it's one clip that there's thousands like that. At some point in that game, the main character gets beaten and clawed by a leopard, right? So just look a bit at the clip. Is it realistic? She pushes the animal with her elbow. She'd be dead in real life immediately. But even if she was lucky, she'd be handicapped for life, right? In this quick time event, she not only survives it, she gets up. She doesn't have any scars, any scratches, and she doesn't even limp. So is it believable? No, right? We could say that it's kind of suspension of disbelief. In action movies, there's a lot of that, like people jump from bridges, like they survive explosions, and etc. But I'd say that suspension of disbelief here is not really the whole story. Maybe it's something else. And I would like to introduce you to the concept of selective attention. So selective attention is when you block out stuff, when you're focused on your task, and you block awareness to be more performant in your task. You might be familiar with this test. The invisible gorilla test is really famous. You might not know what the name of the concept behind it is. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, the gorilla test is you put a lot of subjects in a room. They do this very complex, coordinated thing. They pass the ball. They have to change positions and everything. And at some point, an actor dressed as a gorilla enters the room, waves at the camera, and exits. And they don't notice it. They don't notice the actor. Most subjects, actually, when they see the video, they need to see the video to believe it, because if you tell them someone just walked by and you didn't see, they don't believe. So really, this is an example of selective attention. It's something where you're so focused on what you're doing that you ignore the obvious. And here's a definition. So to me, that's more in line with what happened in the Tomb Raider example. Selective attention actually is built in video games. It's built in the language of video games. Look at this beautiful jungle, for instance, right? Like the sun, the lush environments, etc. In real life, there's no floating white box saying trophy earned, right? You're supposed to ignore that. It's not just the shell of the console or the platform. In real life, there's also no HUD, right? There's no UI. In real life, there's no minimap, there's no quest markers, there's no combo counters. It's implied that you have to block out that with your mind. And yeah, some games don't have UI, sure, or try to do with minimal UI, but still, you have to block out stuff when you play things. So this, for example, this is a Guardian boundary in VR. When you're playing VR, you have to have those unless you want to crash into a wall and break your equipment. It's implied, and it doesn't really break immersion or believability. You just kind of tune it out of your awareness. So final example. Let's look at the Uncharted series, and also let's kind of explain why we're talking about this. We're talking about this to explain what simulation boundary is. So Uncharted, like this is the fourth one, was released in 2016. It's also like super high fidelity for its time, still today. Great attention to detail, great presentation, etc. Motion capture, amazing, right? Another random clip. So look at what's happening on the screen. The player shoots a rocket at a ship. The ship doesn't collapse. There's no hole. There's no fire. The cover, the boxes, are still intact. Also, he's swinging from a rope and lands without breaking any bones. Right? Let's just slow down for a second. By the way, where did the rope go? Right? Like, is it pulled back into his body? Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's a game. You're not supposed to pay attention to it. It's irrelevant. You're not supposed to pay attention to it because it's supposed to be fun, right? It's not about suspension of disbelief. It's about selective attention. The game built affordances for you. You've learned how the game works. You've learned how cover works. You don't pay attention to the rest. So really, this is what we usually call simulation boundary. It's sort of a bubble around the player. All games have that, by the way. It's sort of an academic concept, but also a design concept. The player builds awareness of the systems, and beyond those, nothing really matters. It's like a bubble of affordances. So, with those three concepts, fidelity, selective attention, and sim boundary, those are going to be kind of the building blocks for the rest of the talk. And yeah, so are you still with me so far? Okay, because now we're going to do the case for fidelity, and we're going to measure the pros and cons afterwards. But yeah, let's just jump into it. So this is Microsoft Simulator 98. It's not really the first Microsoft simulator, by the way. I just picked this one because at the time it was the first one to have buildings, and so at the time it was really outstanding fidelity. By today's standards, it kind of looks awful, but like at that time it was wonderful. And let's compare it to the last game in the series. This one looks almost photorealistic, right? It's really well made. And I'm just going to shut up for a second and just cycle through some screenshots in silence so we can soak it in. It feels like you're there, right? In the air, in the cockpit. Like, it feels real. It feels really real. It feels like wizardry almost, and it kind of is. They modeled the entire world based on satellite data. It's really interesting. They used AI to do that. And the result is basically majestic, beautiful, eerie. And I watched a documentary recently about the game. And one quote of one of the developers stuck with me. This was during the global lockdown. And the developer couldn't visit his family. So he just called them and booted the game and flew there and said, I'm as close to you as I can get. He flew home in the game. So it's not really about like status or machines or whatever. It's really about like, it's a spiritual thing. Fidelity helps you connect with others, with the world, and with yourself, right? It's really powerful. And to some extent, it also builds a foundation to the concept of the one true sim. So going back to Tomb Raider, she now looks like this, but she used to look like this, right? And for another example for variety, this is the main character of God of War, and right now, in 2018, the last installment in the series, the main character looks way more believable. It's a massive jump in fidelity. Tomb Raider specifically, just her hair in 2013 had 100 more times detailed than her entire body when she first started. Same thing goes for God of War, but it's just like we're just comparing to the face, but the principle is the same. So we have to ask one question. Back then, those games looked beautiful. Now they kind of look awful. So maybe in the future, when we look at current gen, we're also going to think, like, current gen looks awful, right? Like, how will games look in the future? Maybe one day we'll cross real life, right? And that's kind of the idea of the one true sim. It's not really something new, it's an old idea. It kind of started like this. People made drawings on walls, and those drawings, those pictures started moving when they lit fires. Like the shadows would change stuff, and they could relive the past. They could share tales of possible futures. They could share memories. They could create stories. And it kind of evolved, right? It's an old aspiration. But it's been said also for this movie, like when the Lumiere brothers showed this, people were so afraid that they left the theater. So it's actually maybe an urban legend. There's no way to prove that, but I kind of understand where it comes from. Like, imagine you've never seen a movie, and the first time you see something like a movie, it's this, and you see a train coming your way. Obviously, it's like for the first time, it must be really powerful. And so maybe in the future we'll all be connected in the Matrix or the metaverse or whatever. We're going to be in the super simulation, and they will be like super immersed in fake worlds which are indistinguishable from reality, etc., etc. That's the dream for a lot of people. A lot of people want this. There's a lot of money riding on this idea. Especially people who've been playing games since the very beginning. Like imagine if you've been playing games since the 80s, you've seen just a bunch of pixels moving in the screen, and suddenly now you're playing these massive open worlds, like with really detailed characters, detailed worlds. There's a lot of money in this, and just like you see the amount of effort that went into this replica of this actress, right? Like there's a lot of companies joined effort, so it's safe to believe that a lot of people want this and a lot of people believe in this. Like that actress is still not 100% convincing, by the way, but still the future looks promising. And that was my, basically, case for Fidelity. Now comes the fun part. So for the rest of this talk, I will argue against Fidelity, and I will argue against every single point I just made. I will probably make bold claims, and hopefully, I will convince you that some of those are plausible. Let's look at FIFA, 3 games by EA Canada. So in the beginning, in the year 2000, the characters in FIFA looked very polygonal. They looked kind of alien. After, 11 years later, it's a massive jump in fidelity. It's like they look way, way better. It's like way more believable. You can still see that it's computer graphics, but it's a massive jump. And 11 years later after that, you can still tell that it's rendered. It looks more real. It's not such a massive jump, I would argue, right? Another example, so it doesn't look like I'm cherry-picking examples. We could be here like cherry-picking, like giving tens of thousands of examples, but let's just use those 2. So the Elder Scrolls series, by today's standards even, it's kind of like Morrowind in 2002, kind of looks okay. 4 years later, it looks way, way better, like a massive jump in fidelity. And 5 years later, it looks better as well. It's not such a massive jump. So what am I trying to say here? There's actually no way of measuring this. But you might agree, or you should agree, that the jumps are smaller and smaller, right? The same goes for FIFA as well. So again, I could give you 10 examples here, but we'd be here all day. This picture might not be true, and you kind of have to agree with that. It doesn't, like in reality, it's not a straight line. In reality, it goes like this. Maybe the blue line is not exactly where it's supposed to be. Maybe I have no way of knowing where the blue line is. I think it's exactly there, and I will explain that in a second, but you don't have to believe me on that. All you have to do is to believe that this is possible. And if this is possible, the one true sim, it's possible that it's also a waste of time to pursue. Some of you will say, well, this doesn't make any sense. Obviously, we'll reach the one true sim thing. It's a matter of time. Don't you remember the examples you just gave in the beginning? Like photographs are like undistinguishable from real life, and so like film as well at the moment, right? Game of Thrones, people complain about the CGI of the dragons, but that's because they don't know that all of the castles are made in CGI and they don't notice it, right? So if it can be done with films, why not with video games? Well, first of all, no. Photos is kind of doing fine, but it's not doing great in movies at the moment. It's kind of going downhill. And people became more aware of this in 2014, back when this documentary was released. It became a bit more mainstream. The studio that made Life of Pi gains an Oscar, and 2 weeks later they declare bankruptcy. And I picked this frame because the person here is saying that the root cause is a myth that the consumer has, that as technology improves, so does fidelity, which is not true. Fidelity doesn't improve automatically. To illustrate this point, let's imagine that this represents the amount of effort that you have to put in a photo. For a movie, it's obviously way more frames, right? So imagine 25 frames a second, that's kind of 25 more effort per second. And imagine a 2-hour movie or a 13-hour series. But it's actually not that, it's even worse. So it's not really the frames per se, but the series, the sequence, how the frames relate to one another. Every frame in relation to every other frame tells a story. And to give you like a very simple example, these are 2 circles, super easy to render, but still, look at what happens with different timing. So just by the way of shuffling, it's exactly the same frames. Just by sequencing them in a different way, you perceive something completely different. You perceive different mass, you perceive different elasticity. A movie is way, way, way more complicated than a picture. And so in that same spirit, video games are way, way, way more complicated than movies. Video games are about real-time rendering. Video games are about choice. Choice is key, and so consequences are key, right? Like you can traverse spaces. The whole point is that you can change in real time how things look. You can interact with physics, with NPCs. At best, even if you're making a choose-your-own-adventure game, what you're making is a multi-dimensional video. So it's not surprising that as years go, and as fidelity increases, development costs are also rising. And that's also a bold claim, right? But this time I have data to prove what I'm saying. So you don't have to trust me. Someone way smarter than me analyzed this in 2017. And so if you don't believe me, believe him. He graphed budgets for 260 games, marketing excluded, and he found out this. So I'm going to show a slide where this same data is a bit more readable. This is a log scale, by the way. So if you're not very math savvy, what a log scale is that the vertical axis on the left is accelerating, basically. And it kind of looks like a straight line, doesn't it? So if it looks straight, but it's accelerating, we know that the costs are exponential. So let's recap. This is where we are, and it's likely that fidelity is plateauing. One thing is certain, costs are going to rise and rise and rise to an absurd amount. Costs are exponential, and there's no way to stop that. That's a scary thing, right? We'll come back to this. So fidelity is not cost-effective. Costs are getting out of hand. How did we get here? Maybe it's about the way we talk about games and market them. So let's go back to this example for a second. Despite how unbelievable this scene feels, this game has volumetric hair. It's weird, right? Why is hair prioritized? It's a bit suspicious. If fidelity is driven by consumer demand, why would the consumer be more worried about hair than scars? Why would the consumer put one kind of believability over the other? It feels kind of arbitrary, no? Maybe it's not driven by consumer demand. Maybe it's tech companies trying to sell their product to us. So, in a way, there's nothing wrong with that. They come to us, they try to push their new product, or plugin, or the engine, whatever, and we gladly accept it, right? Because the game industry is all about spectacle. Whoever has the most impactful visuals, the most impactful new screenshots or trailers, they're the ones that get the most media coverage, right? So maybe it all started here. It's kind of nonsense, right? It doesn't make any sense. Because I don't know if you remember the whole thing about simulation boundary, is that you can block out things. We've trained consumers to want something that actually doesn't impact how they play. So you might be familiar with this meme, right? Video games require sim boundaries. They require selective attention. Selective attention actually does a lot of heavy lifting in the way you experience play. That's why you actually misremember the fidelity of old games. You always fill in the details. It's not really a flaw that's built in video games. So the reason why the boat doesn't explode is because there wouldn't be a platform, so it wouldn't be a platforming game. There would be no enemies, so like there would be no tension, there would be no cover, etc. So really, it feels like we've created artificial demand. Maybe the one true sim thing is just an excuse to sell new tech to the consumer. Like, and think about it for a second. For the one true sim thing to actually be believable, every affordance of real life, every expectation, every physics system, etc., it would all need to be there, right? Everything would have to behave the same way as real life. So it's impossible. So to recap, the myth of the one true sim might be built on nonsensical incentives. And let's look at the consequences of that. Sorry. So common sense says that when you're developing a game, you can't have all three of those. Right? You have to pick two, or you have to pick one. So if prices keep on rising for all games, and if you believe in common sense, you have to believe one of these. You'll spend more money, you'll play less content, games will be more buggy, or option 4, all of the above. Let's look at the present and see how things have played out so far for consumers. Aggressive monetization. Most games now are service-based. They have in-app purchases everywhere, season passes, gambling mechanics, etc. Less variety. Games are more similar. They have more repetitive content, more automated content, emptier worlds. Games are now kind of developed post-launch, constant patching, fixes take years. That's the present for consumers. It's only going to get worse. So for us, if costs are increasing, teams are bigger, etc., it's safe to assume that you'll spend a bigger chunk of your life per game in a single game, developing that game. And it's also safe to assume that you'll do smaller and smaller features. You'll spend more and more time dealing with overhead, more planning, more version control, etc. If most games are live for patching and monetization, your work can be just deleted by anyone at any time for no reason. And even if it's not, it will be eventually sunsetted. So let's look at the next steps, right? That was the case against Fidelity, disproving the case for Fidelity. What can we do? It's simple. We have to debunk the narrative that Fidelity is cost-effective, that progress is inevitable. If there's a ceiling, we have to fight against the myth of the one true sim. We have to retake video games from tech companies and debunk the narrative that we need shiny new tech to sell video games. If there's a ceiling, trying to outdo the competition is a race to the bottom. If there's a ceiling, maybe we should call it quits now, before costs start getting out of hand. Maybe we should go back to the basics. Maybe we don't need the one true sim. Maybe it's a lost cause. And maybe we should take inspiration from other disciplines, like painting, and ditch photorealism altogether for something more subjective. How do we do that? Well, if you're a consumer, indie games have been holding the torch for stylized graphics for years. They have a tradition of achieving real believability, high believability with low fidelity. They're experimental, they're weird. That's exactly where new visual languages are born. But more importantly, by supporting indie games, you're making a business case against Fidelity. You're proving that the game industry doesn't need photorealism to be profitable. If you are a developer, your mission should be fighting misinformation. For starters, we have to raise awareness that Fidelity is not about hardware. It's just more time and money. So for instance, a few weeks ago, GTA 6 was leaked. There was like a 90-minute footage thing going on, and consumers freaked out, complaining about Fidelity. It's not surprising, because the average consumer is not aware that it takes a lot of effort and time. So what happened was, in solidarity, it's kind of unprecedented. The game development community shared footage of earlier builds of their games on social media. This is only 3 examples, but there's countless. If you go on Twitter, a lot of consumers at first didn't even believe that those videos were real. They couldn't believe it, basically. We need more of this. If we want to fix this and curb the artificial demand for Fidelity, we, developers and consumers, we have to unite and work on this together. And that was basically the case against Fidelity. Thanks for listening. I hope I could convince some of you. If you like this talk, please follow me on Twitter. And yeah, I think I actually went through the slides really fast, so I guess there's a lot of time for questions. Thank you.
Hey, great presentation. I have a love and hate relationship with your presentation, because for half of the time I wanted to hug you, and for the other half I wanted to strangle you. And I don't want to change it into a discussion, because it's having those emotions, for me it means that was a very great talk. But you're pointing out to have inspiration from art, which is impressionism, which in art the whole point was in pursuit of answering the question, what is reality? And therefore now art is asking a bigger question, what is art really? When games are more of an entertainment, right? So when you have those two conflicting ideas of what is the point of making a game, is it in pursuit of answering bigger question like what is life, what is art, and just providing entertainment, which can be a different whole pursuit and objective. How do you combine those two objectives and should we even do that and just focus on providing entertainment, whatever it is? So what is the point of looking at other art forms that have different objectives than games?
So that's a great question. So if I'm just going to repeat your question, or if I understood it correctly. So you're asking if the examples that I gave were really art-driven and art like with a big A, and since video games are kind of entertainment as well, is it appropriate to even compare the two, right? That's a really great question, and I'm tempted to agree with you and play devil's advocate to myself, but that's because the argument seems so obvious that it's not the case. So let's give you an example. Art with a big A is kind of a myth. Like visuals have always been for consumption, right? Like we tend to see painting as something that exists in a museum, but it kind of always lived. Like if you think about graffiti and etc., like visual arts are not really in a pedestal, so to speak. And so I would say that painting, like the very beginning of painting, and even like the amateur kind of painting, is also entertainment, or is also consumeristic. What happened, the reason why things changed, was actually not because some authors suddenly went, we're going to go with more subjective art. It was also because at some point it kind of became irrelevant. So if you think about it, like all of the painting became more abstract and more like subjective when photography was invented. So the whole point was, if it's not cost effective to spend like months painting this person in detail, I can just take a picture. What is even painting? So because they reached that point, they went, you know, painting can be anything. And I think if we, like the similarities, I think, are there for video games. If at some point we decide, you know, it's not working out, we can just roll back and do exactly as they did. I don't know if that answers your question.
Hi, fantastic talk, loved it. I was wondering about the slide, one of the last slides you've presented about what can we do to make sure that we are sustainable in the sense of visual fidelity. And you mentioned taking games away from tech companies, which I think is a very noble goal, but one that gets pretty outshined whenever some doo-doo head on Twitter posts the first Unreal Engine project in which they remake The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time in Unreal Engine with ray tracing and 8K upscaling, and it gets 20,000 retweets and they get millions of comments of Nintendo, please hire this man. How do we, as developers, if you have an idea, how can we, as developers, fight that mentality that the most recent and most glaring, so to speak, tech doesn't get glamorized in the way it gets glamorized by these internet communities and by consumers to the point of basically fetishization?
So if I understood your question, it's how can we fight the communities that fetishize fidelity, basically, right? So I'm a bit biased because honestly, I'm not the kind of player that really fetishizes that, but I think it's a mistake to demonize those communities. And my initial version of this presentation didn't include the case for fidelity. And I included it especially because I think to bridge that gap, and so we all work together, we have to respect also people that see the value in it. I do see the value in it. Like the first time I played Microsoft Flight Simulator, or actually, my first experience wasn't with Microsoft Flight Simulator, it was with Google Earth, which actually is not that big of a deal when it comes to like detail, but still, to see my home in VR. Google Earth in VR is incredible. It's majestic, by the way. If you haven't tried it, please do. Like to just crouch and see my little house where I am. If it was just subjective or whatever, if it like was not really well made and didn't represent reality, it wouldn't be impactful. And so I think it's a mistake to say, you know, this is tribe A, this is tribe B, and we're going to fight them. It's not that. It's really that we have to see pragmatically that sometimes like just not doing fidelity is kind of also bad because it's a really powerful tool. I think in the long run, the way we bridge those two point of views is to say, you know, cost effective is not a word that we can use to describe fidelity. At some point, it's going to get out of hand. And I raise those points because I think either way, like however you feel about it, as developers, we can kind of all agree, for instance, that we don't want to see our work deleted for no reason, or that we don't want to play more buggier games. That makes sense.
Thank you very much. I'm fully convinced, although I didn't need convincing for the case against fidelity. My question is, you said what we as developers should do, what should happen, and I'm wondering what do you think will actually happen in the coming years?
So your question is, there's things we should do and there's what will actually happen. So as a person, I'm kind of pessimistic in general, so I don't really want to develop on that, but I think I kind of answered your question without saying much. Is that okay? Yeah.
Well, I actually agree as well. I mean, I've been pretty frustrated with the kind of art style of games taking a bit of a backseat, seeing some spiritual successors to games come out, to games that came out 7, 8 years ago, and somehow those games, even though I'm sure if you analyze it on a technical level, the new one is more impressive, but it still looked better in the old game, if you know what I mean. But to play devil's advocate, I guess to expand on your point about VR, do you think that there is a case for more visual fidelity in some use cases, like, you know, in like a VR Outlast, you go into an insane asylum and it just enhances the immersion in that sense? Like, do you think that that's appropriate there? Or?
Yeah, so your question is if there's cases where it's appropriate, like if fidelity is actually not that bad, right? And like you've used VR where immersion is really important as an example. So I don't even think like it's bad to begin with. So in VR, it's actually really effective to have high fidelity props and assets and environments and characters. I actually think like it's not just in VR, it's good everywhere. It might not be my cup of tea every time, obviously, but I think it's really powerful, and that's kind of what I hinted at. I had a brief career in VR as a designer as well, and I can tell you that people really reject things that they don't see as true, and so for it to really be effective, you have to have proper lighting, for instance, like proper occlusion, etc. I think the problem might be when we reach a point where you will spend 4 years modeling a cup, if that makes sense. If we reach a point like that, I think we kind of all are going to be unhappy. And so it's not really a question of if fidelity was free and we could reach that, and maybe with machine learning, maybe all of what I said doesn't apply because we're going to invent some new tech. But if that's the case, if what I said is true, if it's possible that it's true, imagine what it would be, right? Like, because if you compare like games in the very beginning, if you compare Doom, I think that game the first one was made like with a team of 10 people, right? Like, things are getting out of hand. So if you look at before and now, you should like do the same thing for now and the future. That's my only problem, you know? And I think it should really be something that we have to discuss, because I think it's kind of a taboo topic, and we think about it, it's in our minds, but we don't really express a lot about it in between us. So it's not really that fidelity is bad. I hope that's not the takeaway from this talk. But it is that if it's not free, are we willing to pay any cost for it, basically?
A bit of preamble. I've been to talk earlier on GAC by Demetrius Liao about the making and the art direction in Callisto Protocol, for which I am fairly excited, and they displayed a lot of interesting tech. They showcased their very high fidelity character models. They showcased some very impressive, in my opinion, application of AI to mold the environmental art. And they highlighted how they were using all this technology to build atmosphere and tension. And they highlighted, they showed a bit of gameplay footage. All looked very impressive. And Callisto Protocol is still a game I fairly look forward to. But I still find myself looking more forward to a different upcoming science fiction horror game, which is Signalis, which is a very stylized game using flat colors, sharp contrasts. I highly recommend the demo to anyone who likes sci-fi horror, by the way. And do you recall any examples where you would say where you could contrast two examples where you feel a low fidelity stylized approach does a job better than a high fidelity example?
Yeah. So. You asked me if there's any example of a stylized game that kind of does the same thing, but with less resources, if I understood correctly.
Not specifically a game, but mostly games, yes.
Yeah. So one of the examples that I used was Inside by Playdead, and to even say that it's low fidelity is kind of a mistake because they spend a lot of time working on the visuals of that game. So it's not really, it's less tech or it's less time or whatever, but it's like the character doesn't look photoreal, I think. And it's still very effective. It's actually way more effective because it's a bit less noisy. They cut a lot of detail so you can focus on more important stuff. I think it's an artistic choice. On the whole, you also mentioned other games that were showcased. I won't comment on that, but I really want to play those as well. There's a part of me that kind of felt that it was a bad idea to give this talk here, where the Polish industry is really good at high fidelity, and most of the studios are really strong. And it was kind of a provocation because I also think this is where maybe the best place where we could discuss this. But it doesn't mean by any means that those games shouldn't exist or they're not good. But on the contrary, I actually really want to play the game that you just mentioned. And I'm not saying by any means that Inside, for instance, is less impressive or more impressive or whatever. I'm not comparing at all, right? That's so just wanted to make that note. I don't know if I've answered your question.
So I think, great talk, by the way. I really agree with that. But the problem I see is that we are sort of in an information bubble. So we are very passionate about games, obviously, but I really feel that outside the bubble, there are a lot of players that actually really want to play games that are very, maybe not realistic, but high in fidelity. And I feel that we are kind of past the point where we showed the players that we can do that we can make the hair that you showed. And do you think there is any way to go back, to tell them, no, we don't do that anymore? So I'm thinking that it is really we are already past the point when we can revert that. So it only the only way is to go back to indie games and do all of that. Is there any way to go back?
So how can we convince consumers to want less fidelity in a way? Is that okay? I think there's a convincing way where we track stability of games and compare it. If we make consumers more aware, because it's kind of consumers keep complaining. If you look at it, it's kind of memeable, game companies, they're so greedy and etc. It's not companies are not greedy. Companies are starting to fail more and more. But yes, they're raising costs. But if we explain them why, and if we explain, the drop in quality over the years, for everybody, right? Launches that go wrong. There's so many different parts. There's so many complex things. Games are now so complex that even if one part fails, there's an entire domino thing that explodes. If consumers are aware that for bare particles in, I don't know, fire sparks, they're doing that. They're doing that trade-off. maybe they're not going to choose that, is my view. If we made sure they understand why things are happening, maybe they go, you know, like PS5 and PS4, yeah, it's a jump, but I don't need like games to be developed for 20 years in the near future to have just a little more highbrow depth in some character, or like teeth polygons or whatever. And I'm sure that we can kind of convince them of that. I think it's a sensible argument. I think there's time for one more question.
Yeah, hi. Great talk. But do you think there might be a bit hidden value to chase of the fidelity, which is technological progress, because companies that usually could afford to chase this quality pave the way for smaller studios to catch up with higher quality, better tools, and better development processes?
So, could you repeat your question? Sorry.
In short, do you think that there might be a hidden value to chasing fidelity, which is technological progress, which allows smaller less studios with less money to actually catch up with better visuals, better technology?
So if it's like if you raise the bar for like if big tech companies raise the bar in fidelity, like smaller companies might profit from that, and if there's benefit from that, right?
Yeah, they profit because they pave the way in technology with stuff like ray tracing, or for example, back in PS1 era, there wasn't really rigging or bounce animation, and every process of creating animations was jittery and more painful. But because of this progress, things actually get easier and more accessible to smaller developers.
So I see your point, and at first glance, it's obvious that yes. Like if you look, for instance, the last Unreal 5 demo, like the whole millions of polygons in one go, like that, the nanite stuff, it's really, really impressive. And I mean, as a solo developer, imagine, I could go into Unreal and like import like some really high detailed mesh and work with that. And I think recently I even saw someone made a Superman game out of the Matrix demo, and it's really impressive. So I don't doubt that. The thing is, to make a full-fledged product, then you can't really import stuff or just go with the standard robot character or anything. You actually have to work on your own stuff, or you buy assets, and it becomes sort of an asset flip market, which I think consumers are not a fan of at the moment. Like if you look at Unity, because of the asset store and shared resource and everything, a lot of games started looking similar, and consumers started complaining. So yes, but that would be if we assume that technology in and of itself improves games, and you don't have to spend countless hours fine-tuning and retooling and making so like if that's the case, maybe we're actually trapping smaller companies, because we're saying, oh, here you go, new tools, and they're like, but we don't want to work with those, they actually take more time. But yeah, now that's the new benchmark, work with that. And maybe companies, smaller ones, just start disappearing. And with that, you might have, like, the only way the games industry is going to be more profitable is if companies merge, and like there's less competition, there's less variety, there's less genres. You've seen also like a lot of genres like some of them are now resurging with Kickstarter and everything, but a lot of genres kind of died over the last 2 decades, for instance, because of that. It's like if you really want to make a game, you have to make a blockbuster, right? Like it needs to sell really well, and you need to outstand from all of the competition. So I'm not really sure that we've done smaller companies a favor by raising the bar. Sometimes yes, obviously, but in the long run, I'm not sure. And yeah, it's that was the final question. I've just been told. So thank you again.